The November wind cut through Chicago's streets like a blade, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would test every soul caught in its path. Elijah Carter pulled his weathered navy jacket tighter around his 53-year-old frame, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came with both age and too many nights sleeping on concrete. The rain hadn't started yet, but he could smell it in the air, that metallic scent that warned of nature's fury about to unleash itself upon the city. He'd been walking for hours, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to wait out what the weather reports promised would be a brutal night. The shelters were full, as they always seemed to be when desperation peaked, and the usual doorways and alcoves offered little protection from what was coming. His boots, worn thin from years of walking these same streets, splashed through puddles. That reflected the neon signs of businesses closing their doors for the night. When the first drops began to fall, Elijah quickened his pace. Within minutes, those drops became a torrential downpour that soaked through his jacket and sent rivers of water coursing down the sidewalks. Lightning illuminated the empty streets in stark, momentary clarity, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around him. This wasn't just rain. This was nature's declaration of war against anyone foolish enough to be caught outside. Desperation drove him toward the small bakery on Maple Street, its darkened windows offering no welcome but promising shelter. The alley behind it was narrow and filled with dumpsters, but more importantly, it had a back door that looked old enough to have seen better days. Elijah had never been one to break the law, not even during his darkest moments on the streets, but hypothermia cared nothing for moral principles. The lock gave way easier than he'd expected, and suddenly he found himself in the warm, yeast-scented darkness of the bakery's storage room. For the first time in hours, he could hear something other than the howling wind and driving rain. His relief was short-lived, however, as the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, followed by the authoritative voice of a Chicago police officer who'd been making his rounds. What followed was a blur of explanations that fell on deaf ears, handcuffs that felt heavier than they should have, and a ride to the station that marked the beginning of what most would assume was just another sad story in a city full of them. Elijah Carter, homeless veteran, caught breaking and entering. It was a tale as old as the streets themselves, one that typically ended with a few nights in lockup and a return to the very circumstances that had led to the crime in the first place. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has other plans. Sometimes a storm that seems like the end of everything becomes the beginning of something entirely different. As Elijah sat in that holding cell, water still dripping from his graying hair, he had no idea that his name, his full name, would soon trigger a chain of events that would change everything. The irony wasn't lost on him that after surviving firefights in Iraq, roadside bombs in Afghanistan, and countless nights on Chicago's unforgiving streets, it would be a broken lock and a desperate need for shelter that would finally bring his story full circle. But that's how life works sometimes. The moments that matter most often arrive disguised as our worst disasters. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside that cell, with its concrete walls and fluorescent lighting, Elijah Carter was about to discover that sometimes the darkest nights precede the brightest dawns. His journey from forgotten hero to homeless statistic was about to reverse course in ways he never could have imagined, all because one November night, he chose survival over propriety and broke into a bakery's back room. Judge Rebecca Caldwell had presided over hundreds of cases just like this one, homeless individuals caught in desperate circumstances, their stories blending together in a tragic symphony of addiction, mental illness, and societal failure. She'd learned to maintain professional distance while still treating each defendant with dignity, understanding that behind every case file was a human being whose life had taken an unfortunate turn. This Tuesday morning seemed no different as she reviewed the docket, her coffee growing cold beside a stack of folders that represented the city's ongoing struggle with homelessness. When the bailiff called The People versus Elijah Carter, she looked up to see a man whose weathered appearance told the familiar story of life on the streets. His navy jacket, though worn and stained, was worn with a dignity that spoke of military service, something she'd seen countless times before. Veterans comprised a heartbreaking percentage of Chicago's homeless population, and Judge Caldwell had long ago learned to recognize the particular bearing that military training leaves behind, even in the most broken individuals. The prosecutor began his routine recitation of charges: breaking and entering, criminal trespass, destruction of property. Standard charges for what appeared to be a standard case, the kind that would typically result in time served and a return to the streets within days. But when the public defender stood to introduce his client, something extraordinary happened that would later be remembered as the moment when fate decided to intervene in the most unexpected way possible. Your Honor, my client is Elijah Michael Carter, age 53, a Navy veteran who served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The middle name stopped Judge Caldwell cold. Elijah Michael Carter. The name hit her like a physical blow, carrying with it a flood of memories she'd thought were safely buried in the past. Her cousin Diego's voice echoed in her mind from a phone call years ago, his voice breaking as he described the sailor who'd saved his life. The courtroom seemed to fade around her as the memory crystallized with startling clarity. Diego, her cousin who'd served as an army medic, had called her from Germany, where he was recovering from injuries sustained during an ambush in Fallujah. Through tears and medication-induced grogginess, he'd told her about the Navy corpsman who'd crawled through enemy fire to reach him, who'd carried him through a minefield while under attack, who'd quite literally saved not just his life but the lives of several other soldiers that day. Elijah, Diego had whispered into the phone that night, his voice filled with reverence. Elijah Michael Carter. I'll never forget that name as long as I live. But somehow, in the chaos of Diego's recovery and the years that followed, they'd lost track of the man who'd given Diego a second chance at life. The family had tried to find him after the war, wanting to thank him properly, but military bureaucracy and the passage of time had made their search impossible. Judge Caldwell found herself staring at the defendant in a completely new light. This wasn't just another homeless veteran. This was the man her family had been searching for. The hero whose actions had ripple effects that touched every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every moment of Diego's life that he'd been able to experience because of one sailor's extraordinary courage. The irony was almost overwhelming. The man they'd sought to honor was standing before her as society's forgotten, facing charges for the simple act of seeking shelter from a storm. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her pen, her mind racing through the implications of this revelation. Professional protocol demanded that she proceed with the case as she would any other, but her heart screamed that this was anything but ordinary. This was divine intervention disguised as a criminal proceeding, a chance to right a wrong that had gone uncorrected for far too long. "I'm calling for a recess," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. The attorneys looked puzzled. Recesses weren't typically called this early in such straightforward proceedings, but they gathered their papers obediently. As the courtroom cleared, Judge Caldwell remained seated, staring at the file that contained the bare facts of Elijah Carter's recent troubles, while her mind filled with the rich story of his heroism that had never made it into any official record. Chakun. 15-minute recess stretched into 30, as Judge Caldwell sat in her chambers, her hands shaking as she dialed her cousin Diego's number. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, warm with the contentment of a man who'd built a good life on borrowed time. She'd always been able to hear the gratitude in his voice, even during casual conversations, the subtle reminder that every word he spoke was a gift made possible by someone else's sacrifice. "Diego, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Fallujah, about the sailor who saved you." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had been lost. When Diego finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, taking on the reverent tone it always carried when he talked about that day. "Why are you asking about Elijah?" Diego's question carried years of searching, years of wondering what had happened to the man who'd given him everything. "We never found him, Becca. I've looked everywhere. The Navy said his records were complicated, that he'd had some kind of breakdown after discharge. But that man was a hero in every sense of the word. He didn't just save my life. He saved Martinez, Johnson, and probably 3 other guys who would have died in that ambush." Judge Caldwell closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she was about to tell him. "He's standing in my courtroom right now, Diego. Elijah Michael Carter, Navy veteran, charged with breaking into a bakery to escape a storm." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. When Diego spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Are you certain? Elijah Michael Carter? Dark hair, probably graying now, about 6 feet tall, has a scar above. His left eyebrow from shrapnel." Each detail Diego provided matched the man standing in her courtroom, building a case that went far beyond reasonable doubt. This wasn't coincidence. This was destiny finally deciding to show its hand. "I'm certain, Diego, and I'm also certain that whatever brought him to my courtroom today has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the fact that we failed him. The system failed him, society failed him, and now he's facing criminal charges for the simple act of trying to survive." Her voice carried the weight of professional authority mixed with personal conviction, a combination that made her words sound like both a legal judgment and a moral imperative. Diego's reaction was immediate and passionate. "You have to help him, Becca. I don't care what it takes, what it costs, what strings you have to pull. That man gave me my life. He gave me my children, my marriage, everything I have. There has to be something we can do." The urgency in his voice reflected years of guilt over being unable to properly thank the man who'd made his entire future possible. Judge Caldwell was already reaching for her personal phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number. For the Veterans Justice Foundation, an organization she'd worked with countless times before. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just about helping another homeless veteran navigate the system. This time it was about correcting a grave injustice that had been years in the making. "I'm going to make some calls," she told Diego, her voice carrying the determination of someone who'd just discovered that fate had placed exactly the right case on her docket at exactly the right time. "But I want you to start gathering everything you have. Photos, records, anything that documents what happened that day. We're going to make sure Elijah Carter finally gets the recognition he deserves." As she hung up the phone, Judge Caldwell felt the familiar weight of judicial responsibility, but now it carried an additional burden: the responsibility of ensuring that a hero's story didn't end in tragedy. She understood that what happened next would go far beyond the simple resolution of a trespassing case. This was about honoring service, recognizing sacrifice, and proving that it's never too late for justice to find its way to those who deserve it most. The truth beneath the surface was more powerful than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined, and Judge Caldwell was determined to make sure it finally saw the light of day. Adam Mitchell had been practicing law for only 3 years, but his work with the Veterans Justice Foundation had already shown him more heartbreak and triumph than many attorneys see in entire careers. At 28, he possessed the idealism of youth, tempered by the hard-earned wisdom that comes from fighting for society's forgotten members. When his phone rang that Tuesday afternoon, he expected another routine case, another veteran caught in the gap between military service and civilian survival. Judge Caldwell's voice carried an urgency he'd never heard before, even from the most passionate advocates. "Adam, I need you to drop everything and get down to the courthouse immediately. I'm sending you a case that's going to change everything you think you know about justice." The cryptic nature of her request intrigued him, but it was the emotional undertone in her usually composed voice that made him grab his jacket and rush toward the door. When he arrived at the courthouse, Judge Caldwell met him personally, something that had never happened before in their professional relationship. She led him to a small conference room where Elijah Carter sat waiting, his weathered hands folded on the table, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from years of disappointment. Adam had seen that look before in countless clients, but something about this man seemed different, as if beneath the layers of hardship lay a strength that hadn't been completely extinguished. "Elijah," Judge Caldwell said gently, "this is Adam Mitchell. He's going to be your attorney. But more importantly, he's going to help us tell your story the way it should be told." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "Adam, I want you to know that you're not just representing a client today. You're representing a man who saved my cousin's life in Iraq, a man who's been searching for proper recognition, for years. The weight of that revelation settled over Adam like a mantle of responsibility he'd never felt before. This wasn't just about getting charges dropped or securing services for another homeless veteran. This was about honoring a debt that had gone unpaid for far too long, about ensuring that heroism was finally recognized and rewarded rather than punished by circumstances beyond anyone's control. As Judge Caldwell shared the details of Diego's story, Adam watched Elijah's reaction carefully. The older man's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something that looked remarkably like relief. For years, Elijah had carried the weight of his service alone, believing that his struggles with civilian life had somehow diminished the value of what he'd done in uniform. Now, for the first time in decades, someone was telling him that his service mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning beyond his own survival. "The Caldwell family has been looking for you since the war ended," Adam explained, his voice gentle, but firm. "They never forgot what you did, and they never stopped trying to find a way to thank you properly." Judge Caldwell's cousin Diego, the medic you saved, he talks about you at every family gathering. You're not just a memory to them, you're a hero whose story deserves to be told. Adam spent the next hour listening to Elijah's version of events, both from that day in Fallujah and from the years that followed. The picture that emerged was of a man whose heroism had been matched only by his humility, whose service-related trauma had been compounded by a system that failed to recognize his sacrifices, the bureaucratic errors that had prevented him from receiving proper benefits, the mental health struggles that had gone untreated, the gradual slide from respected serviceman to invisible homeless veteran. It was a tragedy that played out too often, but rarely with such stark irony. "Here's what we're going to do," Adam said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd just found his life's most important case. "We're not just going to get these charges dismissed. We're going to make sure you receive every benefit, every honor, every form of recognition that you should have received years ago. The Caldwell family wants to help, and they have the resources and connections to make things happen." As they talked, Adam could see something changing in Elijah's demeanor. The defeated posture was gradually being replaced by something that looked like hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. For the first time in years, Elijah Carter was being seen not as a problem to be managed or a case to be processed, but as a human being whose life had value and whose story mattered. This was legal support with a mission that went far beyond the typical attorney-client relationship. This was about restoring dignity, honoring service, and proving that it's never too late for justice to find its way to those who've been waiting in the shadows for far too long. The research began immediately, with Adam working alongside a team of military historians and record specialists to piece together the full story of Elijah Carter's service. What they discovered was a narrative of heroism that had been buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and administrative error. The official records told only part of the story, but witness statements, unit logs, and personal accounts painted a picture of extraordinary courage under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The ambush in Fallujah had been brutal and swift, turning a routine patrol into a nightmare of enemy fire and improvised explosives. According to the statements of surviving unit members, Elijah had been attached to an Army squad as their Navy corpsman when they'd been caught in a coordinated attack that left several soldiers wounded and pinned down in an exposed position. While enemy fire rained down around them, Elijah had made the conscious decision to leave his own covered position and crawl through active combat to reach the wounded. Diego Caldwell's medical records provided stark testimony to Elijah's heroism. Severe shrapnel wounds, internal bleeding, and a concussion that had left him barely conscious. These were injuries that required immediate medical attention under ideal conditions, let alone while under enemy fire. Yet Elijah had not only reached him, but had managed to stabilize his condition well enough to begin the dangerous journey back to safety through what intelligence reports later confirmed was an active minefield. The Silver Star recommendation had been filed by Elijah's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, whose own statement painted a picture of selfless courage that belonged in military legend. Petty Officer Carter's actions on November 15th were the epitome of military valor, she had written. Despite intense enemy fire and his own safety concerns, he risked everything to save the lives of soldiers he'd known for less than a week. His actions directly resulted in the survival of at least 4 men who would have died without his intervention. But somehow, in the chaos of war and the complexity of inter-service bureaucracy, the medal had never been delivered. Elijah's discharge. Paperwork showed signs of the administrative confusion that had plagued many veterans during the height of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. His records had been transferred between departments, lost in system upgrades, and generally mishandled by a military bureaucracy overwhelmed by the sheer volume of personnel processing required during wartime. The newspaper clippings Adam discovered told an even more poignant story. Local papers in Elijah's hometown had covered his deployment and his heroic actions, interviewing family members who spoke with pride about their son's service. But those same papers later covered his struggles with readjustment, his difficulties finding stable employment, and his gradual disappearance from public view as his circumstances deteriorated. What emerged was the classic story of a hero forgotten by the very system he'd served so faithfully. While other veterans received recognition and benefits, Elijah had fallen through the cracks, his sacrifice unrecognized and his service unrewarded. He'd carried the weight of his actions alone, without the acknowledgement and support that should have been his right as a decorated veteran. The psychological evaluation that Adam commissioned revealed the full extent of what Elijah had endured. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and depression had all been left untreated for years, compounding into a perfect storm of mental health challenges that had made stable civilian life nearly impossible. Yet through it all, Elijah had maintained his dignity and his commitment to helping others, even when he had almost nothing left to give. The irony was heartbreaking. The man who'd once been willing to sacrifice everything to save strangers had been abandoned by a society that had forgotten his sacrifice. But now, finally, his story was being told in full, and the hero they'd forgotten was about to be remembered in the way he should have been all along. The documentation was complete, the witnesses were ready to testify, and justice was finally preparing to reward courage that had gone unrecognized for far too long. The special ceremony took place on a Friday morning in Judge Caldwell's courtroom, but this wasn't the same sterile legal proceeding that had begun the week before. The room had been transformed into something that felt more like a celebration than a court hearing, filled with people whose lives had been touched by Elijah's story in ways both direct and profound. Military officials, veterans advocates, members of the Caldwell family, and media representatives all gathered to witness what many were calling a long overdue correction of a grave injustice. Judge Caldwell had worked tirelessly throughout the week to coordinate with Navy officials, veterans organizations, and congressional representatives to ensure that this ceremony would carry the full weight of official recognition. The charges against Elijah had been dismissed immediately, but that was only the beginning of what she envisioned as a complete restoration of his standing and dignity. Today wasn't just about clearing his criminal record, it was about honoring a hero in the way he should have been honored years ago. Captain Maria Rodriguez, representing the Department of the Navy, stood at attention as she read the citation that should have been delivered decades earlier. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action while serving with Marine forces during combat operations in Iraq, her voice carried through the courtroom with military precision and genuine emotion. Petty Officer Elijah Carter distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism while under enemy fire, risking his life to save fellow service members without regard for his own safety. The Silver Star itself seemed to catch the light as Captain Rodriguez approached Elijah, who stood at attention in a dress uniform that had been provided by a local veterans organization. The medal was heavier than he'd expected, carrying with it not just the weight of metal but the recognition that had been denied to him for so long. As it was pinned to his chest, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pride of a job well done, acknowledged and appreciated by those who mattered most. But the medal was only part of the restoration that Judge Caldwell had orchestrated. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs stood to announce that Elijah's full benefits package would be reinstated immediately, including healthcare coverage, disability compensation for his service-related injuries, and a monthly pension that would ensure he never again faced the desperation that had led to his arrest. The bureaucratic errors that had denied him these benefits for years were being corrected with the stroke of a pen. Diego Caldwell stepped forward to address the courtroom, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke directly to the man who'd given him a second chance at life. "For 20 years, I've wanted to say these words to you in person," he began, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. "Thank you. Thank you for my children, who exist because you saved their father. Thank you for my marriage, which was possible because you brought me home. Thank you for every sunrise I've seen, every laugh I've shared, every moment of joy that came after that day in Fallujah." The impact of Diego's words rippled through the courtroom, touching everyone present with the profound reality of what heroism truly means. This wasn't about abstract concepts of duty and honor. This was about the concrete reality of lives saved, families preserved, and futures made possible by one man's extraordinary courage under fire. Every person in that room understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, the moment when sacrifice is finally acknowledged and honored. Judge Caldwell's voice carried the authority of both law and moral conviction as she addressed the assembled crowd. "Today we correct not just a legal error, but a moral one. Today we restore the recognition that should never have been delayed, and we ensure that Elijah Carter's story becomes part of the permanent record of American heroism." Her words carried the weight of official recognition and personal commitment to ensuring that this injustice would never be repeated. As the ceremony concluded, Elijah stood surrounded by people who now knew his name, his story, and his worth. The invisible man who'd entered this courtroom days earlier had been transformed back into the hero he'd always been, finally receiving the justice he'd been denied for far too long. The storm that had driven him to break into that bakery had ultimately led him to the recognition and restoration he deserved. Proof that sometimes the darkest moments precede the brightest dawn. The apartment on Elm Street wasn't luxurious, but to Elijah it felt like a palace after years of shelters. Doorways and park benches, 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street where children played and neighbors greeted each other by name. It represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever when his life had spiraled into homelessness. The housing initiative for displaced veterans had moved quickly once his benefits were restored, providing not just shelter but a foundation upon which he could rebuild his entire existence. The first night in his own bed, Elijah lay awake listening to sounds he'd almost forgotten. The gentle hum of a refrigerator, the distant murmur of a television from an adjacent apartment, the ordinary nighttime symphony of a safe neighborhood. After years of hypervigilance born from sleeping in dangerous places, the simple ability to close his eyes without fear felt like its own form of miracle. He'd survived war zones and city streets, but somehow this quiet apartment represented the most challenging battlefield of all, the place where he'd have to learn how to live again. The speaking engagements began modestly, with Adam arranging for Elijah to address a small group of veterans at the local VFW hall. Standing behind the podium, looking out at faces that reflected his own struggles and triumphs, Elijah found his voice in a way he hadn't in years. His story resonated with men and women who understood the particular challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian life, especially those who'd faced their own battles with the system that was supposed to support them. Word of his powerful speaking ability spread quickly through the veterans community, leading to invitations from larger organizations, military bases, and civic groups interested in understanding the real cost of war and the real meaning of service. Elijah discovered that his years of hardship had given him something valuable to share. Not just the story of his heroism in Iraq, but the equally important story of resilience in the face of systemic failure and personal struggle. The mentoring position came through a recommendation from Captain Rodriguez, who'd been impressed by Elijah's ability to connect with younger veterans during his speaking engagements. The Department of Veterans Affairs was piloting a new program designed to help recent veterans navigate the transition to civilian life, and they needed mentors who understood both the challenges of military service and the reality of post-service struggles. Elijah's combination of combat experience and personal hardship made him uniquely qualified to guide others through the process he'd had to navigate alone. Working with young veterans gave Elijah a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his military service. These men and women faced many of the same challenges he'd encountered: difficulty finding meaningful employment, struggles with PTSD and other service-related conditions, and the disorienting experience of trying to find their place in a civilian world that often seemed to misunderstand their experiences. Through his mentoring, Elijah could help ensure that their stories didn't end the way his nearly had. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The man who'd spent years avoiding eye contact and trying to remain invisible gradually rediscovered the confidence and bearing that had once defined him as a military leader. His posture straightened, his voice grew stronger, and something that looked remarkably like hope began to replace the resignation that had characterized his features for so long. Diego Caldwell became not just the catalyst for Elijah's transformation, but a genuine friend whose family embraced him as one of their own. Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, and casual weekend barbecues provided Elijah with something he'd been missing for years: a sense of belonging, of being valued not for what he could provide, but simply for who he was. The bond between the two men, forged in the crucible of combat, grew stronger as they shared the ordinary moments of civilian life. The apartment gradually filled with the artifacts of a life being rebuilt: photographs from speaking engagements, certificates of appreciation from veteran organizations, letters from young veterans he'd mentored, and most prominently, the Silver Star displayed in a place of honor where it caught the morning light. Each item represented not just recognition of his past service, but investment in his future contributions. Life after the storm proved to be richer and more meaningful than anything Elijah had dared to imagine during his darkest moments on the streets. The foundation provided by stable housing, adequate health care, and financial security allowed him to focus on rebuilding not just his circumstances, but his sense of self-worth and purpose. He was no longer simply surviving, he was thriving, and in doing so, he was helping others do the same. The transformation from invisible homeless veteran to recognized hero wasn't just about changed circumstances, it was about reclaimed identity in its most fundamental form. For years, Elijah Carter had been nobody to most people who encountered him. Another face in the shelter line, another case file on a social worker's desk, another statistic in the city's ongoing struggle with homelessness. The sound of his own name had become foreign to him, replaced by the generic terms of bureaucratic processing and societal dismissal. But now, walking into the Veteran Center where he worked as a mentor, Elijah experienced something he'd almost forgotten was possible. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the receptionist called out, her voice carrying genuine warmth and respect. The simple act of being greeted by name, his name, spoken with recognition and appreciation, sent a wave of emotion through him that he still hadn't learned to fully process. He was no longer anonymous. He was Elijah Carter, Silver Star recipient, mentor and survivor. The speaking engagement at Northwestern University had been his largest audience yet. Over 400 students and faculty members gathered to hear about military service, veteran issues, and the importance of supporting those who'd served their country. As he approached the podium, Elijah reflected on the irony of the moment. Just months earlier, he'd been arrested for breaking into a bakery, and now he was being introduced as a distinguished veteran and community leader. "Ladies and gentlemen," the university president announced, "please welcome Elijah Carter, Navy veteran, Silver Star recipient, and advocate for veteran affairs." The applause that followed wasn't polite academic courtesy. It was genuine appreciation for someone whose story had touched hearts and opened minds to the complex realities faced by returning veterans. In that moment, Elijah understood that his name carried weight again, that it represented something meaningful to people who'd never met him before today. The young Marine who approached him after the presentation reminded Elijah of himself at that age: proud, idealistic, and completely unprepared for the challenges that lay ahead in civilian life. "Mr. Carter," the young man said, his voice carrying the particular earnestness of someone seeking guidance, "I've been struggling since I got back from deployment. Your story gives me hope that things can get better. The conversation that followed lasted over an hour. Two veterans separated by decades but united by shared experience and mutual understanding. Mentoring had become more than just a job for Elijah. It had become his calling, his way of ensuring that the lessons learned from his own struggles could prevent others from falling through the same cracks that had nearly swallowed him. Each young veteran he worked with represented not just an individual success story, but a victory against the systemic failures that had characterized his own transition from military to civilian life. The letter from the White House arrived on a Tuesday morning, bearing the official seal and an invitation that left Elijah staring at the paper in disbelief. He'd been selected to attend a ceremony honoring veterans who'd made significant contributions to their communities post-service. The letter was addressed specifically to him, Elijah Michael Carter, and signed by officials who knew his story and recognized his contributions. For a man who'd spent years believing he'd been forgotten by his country, the invitation represented validation beyond anything he could have imagined. Diego's family had adopted him as an honorary uncle, and their children knew him not as the homeless man he'd once been, but as Uncle Elijah, the hero who'd saved their grandfather's life and who now told the best stories at family gatherings. Watching those children interact with him, seeking his advice, sharing their achievements, including him in their plans, provided Elijah with a glimpse of the life he might have had if his transition from military service had gone differently. Standing. In his apartment one evening, looking at the wall where his Silver Star was displayed alongside photographs from speaking engagements and letters from veterans he'd mentored, Elijah felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Pride in the life he'd built. Not just pride in his military service, that had never left him, but pride in his resilience, his recovery, and his ability to transform his own suffering into something that could help others. The reflection in his bathroom mirror showed a man who stood straighter, smiled more readily, and met his own gaze with confidence rather than shame. This was Elijah Carter, sailor, survivor, hero, mentor, and valued member of a community that knew his name and appreciated his contributions. He was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, no longer just another statistic in society's failure to care for its veterans. His name was worth remembering now. Not just because of what he'd done in Iraq, but because of what he'd overcome afterward, and what he continued to contribute every day. The storm that had driven him to that bakery door had ultimately led him home to recognition, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that his story had meaning, his service had value, and his name would be remembered for all the right reasons.